Okay, this is the first of 3 sessions or programs concerned with assessment and the relationship of assessment to critical thinking. And reading from the description here, just so that we start off with a kind of sense, we're going to focus on such questions as what is assessment, or putting it somewhat differently, what is evaluation? What role does it play in our everyday lives? How do we go about in everyday life functioning as evaluators and assessors? How does assessment and evaluation differ from subjective preference? This is a very, very important distinction. What role does self-assessment play in critical thinking? We'll touch upon that generally here. What intellectual standards are essential to assessment in critical thinking, and so forth. So we're concerned in this first program with the overall landscape of what is assessment, what is evaluation, to sort of situate ourselves. The second program is going to focus specifically on critical thinking testing and critical thinking test instruments and that sort of thing, although the general questions will come into that. And then in the third program, we're going to focus on how do you teach students to assess their own work. So that's the general plan. And let's now sort of launch into it. If you take the question of what is critical thinking, first of all, as you know, the basic picture I have of it can be presented in various ways, but the essence of the picture is that we are thinkers. Our experience, our decisions, our behavior are a function of our thinking. If we think poorly, it's going to affect our emotional life, our educational life, our life as a shopper, as a citizen, as a parent. Here's the basic assumption. Poor thinking produces poor quality of life. And also the contradictory or parallel assumption, the opposite assumption, good thinking produces good quality of life. Now, if you accept that as a premise, then you can see there's a room for critical thinking. Here's critical thinking. How can I, as a thinker, improve the quality of my thinking? How can I, as a thinker, better understand thinking, how it works, and what it should aspire to, elements and standards, so that I can take charge of my thinking and consistently, regularly improve it to the extent that I have the will, the determination, and the follow-through to do so. So critical thinking, as I'm understanding it, is a kind of self-empowering way of relating to yourself and to your life. It's premised on many assumptions such as we are capable of doing this. We are capable of critical thinking. We are not simply robotic creatures who must think in a certain way. Our genes do not fate us into one mode of thinking. Our environment doesn't determine us to think in only one way. That we are capable of acts of freedom in which we can discover to some extent what our thinking is, discover in varying degrees and at varying degrees of depth what good thinking is, and we can take our thinking and improve it. So you could put this into a kind of catchy saying that critical thinking is thinking about your thinking while you're thinking in order to make your thinking better. And so now then we ask ourselves, well, where might we apply this? And the answer is wherever you're thinking. And where are you thinking and when are you thinking? Always. So therefore, critical thinking is not a subject or content or area, but has to do with the way you as a thinker process anything whatsoever. Whether you're processing religion or processing politics or processing finance or processing reading, or you're now functioning as a writer, or you're now functioning as a listener, you're thinking. And your thinking is determining the quality of this experience that you're having right now. So if you're thinking like a good listener, an effective listener, you know how to take charge of your listening, you get more out of this than if you listen associationally and just sort of let happen what happens when we simply listen with perhaps wandering attention. You learn how to command your attention, because attention is part of thinking. It has to do with focus. Can you focus your thinking? Do you know how to focus your thinking, and so forth? So this is my general sense of what critical thinking is, and I hope that's reasonably intuitive and plausible to you, because everything else is premised on that as a kind of background notion. Now, we say then, what about assessment? We're concerned with evaluation and assessment. No one can escape being an evaluator and an assessor. We all make decisions, and these decisions, one way or another, very often require that we evaluate or we assess. But there is another thing that we can do that needs to be, I think, set out against and in contrast to functioning as an assessor, and that is functioning as a chooser who simply is choosing at this moment or that what you like. Whether what you like is good to like is another matter, but simply choosing what you like. And there's plenty of circumstances where that's an appropriate thing to do. So if I would like to decorate my apartment with velveteen painting, Marilyn Monroe in the buff, and have an orange couch and a polka dot rug, and I like it, that's the end of it. It's my apartment. I have the right to choose that, if that's my subjective preference. If I like butterscotch, you like vanilla, I'm not wrong, you're not wrong. It's a matter of subjective choice. If I prefer the seashore over the desert, and you prefer the desert over the seashore, I don't have to say, what's your evidence? You have a perfect right to say, I just like it. If you like to listen to hard rock and I like to listen to blues, or somebody else likes jazz, or one kind of jazz, or whatever, again, we have a right to our subjective preferences. We have a right to choose amongst different things and to experience them simply because we enjoy it. What do you want for lunch? Do you want this? You want that? You exercise your subjective preference. And when you exercise your subjective preference, and where it's appropriate to use your subjective preference, I have no ground or right to say, give me the reasoning by which you came to that conclusion. I have no reasoning for preferring butterscotch over vanilla. It just tastes better to me. Now, I put this out very clearly because students and teachers commonly confuse circumstances of subjective preference with circumstances which call for objective evaluation. Evaluation is an intellectual process. It is not a subjective psychological process. It may be that our preferences come down to our psychology and various quirks of psychological reality. I have no idea. But in any case, when I say evaluate, I'm not asking you to pull out your subjectivity. I'm asking you to do a series of intellectual acts which have a discipline associated with them in the nature of what is implied in evaluation. Now, evaluation always has a purpose, an agenda. And if you change the purpose, you're going to change the evaluation. Those of you who are familiar with the concept of the elements of reasoning, basic structures that we cannot avoid in our thinking, then you will understand why, if we look at evaluation, we're going to look at a series of logical variables and how they relate to each other. This circle, it's not very neatly drawn, of course, not very much a perfect circle, but it's intended to be circular. There are 8 elements here, eight segments to the circle, because there are 8 structures which you cannot avoid using when you're thinking. And here I'm distinguishing thinking from simply noticing a preference or choosing on the basis of a preference. If you're thinking, at some level, you're trying to make sense of something. You're trying to see what it's like. You're trying to figure it out. And when you think, you can't think without a purpose. And when you think, you can't think without asking a question. Because if I said, what are you thinking about? And you said, well, I'm thinking about the children. I said, what's your question? And you said, no question. I have no questions. Well, maybe you're randomly examining images in your mind, but you're not doing thinking in the sense of reasoning. You're not doing thinking in the sense that knowledge and understanding is going to emerge because you have no question. So we look for, when we're looking at thinking, what is the purpose? What is the question? As soon as you ask a question, then information is potentially relevant to that question. So we have a purpose in thinking. Our purpose involves asking questions and getting answers, solving problems. We need information in order to respond to questions. Information needs to be interpreted, so we can't avoid that. Again, remember, we're talking about what you can't avoid in thinking. I can always ask you, what's the question? Why did you ask it? What's your purpose? What information do we need in order to be able to answer this question appropriately? Then once we get the information, I can ask you, what do you make of this information? What does it mean to you? Here's a poem. What is its meaning? Here's an essay. What is the main point? So you interpret information. You have no choice. You can't not interpret information. But as soon as you interpret information, you use concepts. You can't think without concepts. So I can always ask you what the main concept is here. What's your central idea? Because as you change ideas, you're necessarily going to change thinking. And you could put it this way. If I could control any one of these parts of your thinking, I would control all of your thinking. If I could control all your agendas, so the only agendas you had were the ones I gave you, then I would totally control you. If I could control your questions, you never asked any question but a question that I gave you, had to be cleared by me, then I would control all your thinking. If I could control all your information sources, so you never got any data unless it was cleared through me, I would control your thinking. Or if I could just step in at the level of interpretation, I could control all your interpretations. That would do just as well. Any one of these are controlling factors in thinking because they're unavoidable and they have implications for all of the others.